Okay, great. Wonderful. Thank you all so much for coming. I know that we are on a scale of very anxious to impossibly anxious today. We're gonna do our best to hold it together for our class. I'm so thrilled and honored to welcome Nicole Porter today. Before I do that more formally, I want to thank the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies and the University of Washington Bothell Labor Studies Colloquium for making today's visit possible. This is the second event in a year-long series that we are doing called Labor in a Times of Crisis, and I hope that you can join us for other lectures. We'll have one more lecture that's part of this series this quarter. On November 24th, we'll be hearing from a member of the API Cultural Awareness Group about correctional industries and the Washington State prison system. You can feel free to contact me for more information about those events. And I think also Simon will throw up a link in the chat for how to register for that. If you're in my class, you're already registered, we're fine. But for folks that are not already enrolled in that class, you're welcome to join us on that day. So today I'm very, very delighted to welcome Nicole Porter of the Sentencing Project to speak with us. She is the Director of Advocacy, where she manages the Sentencing Project's state and local advocacy efforts on behalf of sentencing reform, voting rights, and eliminating racial disparities in the criminal justice system. Her advocacy has supported criminal justice reforms in several states, including Kentucky, Missouri, and California. She was named a new civil rights leader by Essence magazine for her work to eliminate mass incarceration. Before coming to the Sentencing Project, she was the director of the Texas ACLU's Prison and Jail Accountability Project, which had as its mission to monitor the conditions of confinement in state jails and prisons. Porter advocated in the Texas legislature to promote felony enfranchisement reforms, to eliminate prison rape, and to improve prison medical care. She received her undergraduate degree from Johns Hopkins University and a Master of Public Affairs from the University of Texas at Austin. And her master's thesis addressed exploring self-employment among formerly incarcerated African Americans. She also studied African politics at the University of Ghana in West Africa. And I highly, highly recommend that you check out her website for a really awesome playlist that I just discovered as I was producing this introduction, but have been listening to ever since. So as with our previous speaker that we had a couple weeks ago, I'm going to ask Nicole a few questions that I have prepared. I want to encourage you to throw questions in the chat as we go, and I will try to seamlessly incorporate that in as we go. But we'll also have time at the end when we'll throw it open for questions as well. So feel free to put things in the chat as we go, and know as well that there will come a time when I will ask for your questions. So Nicole, thank you so much for joining us today. Obviously, this is election day. So we're talking about electoral politics in the midst of an already contested election where issues of voter suppression have been pronounced, among other kinds of issues. But people often talk about red states and blue states in navigating elections, but that framing misses the very simple fact that a lot of adults in this country cannot vote. So to begin with, can you just define what felony disenfranchisement is and how many people are impacted by it?
Yes, well, the Sentencing Project is a bridge organization between, we like to say, between the activists and the academy. So it started in the late 80s as a way to sort of frame research information for the mass public and for the broader community. And we partnered with Chris Eugen, who is a criminology professor at the University of Minnesota, and his research team, including Sarah Shannon at University of Georgia, to publish a report in mid-October, Locked Out 2020, state estimates of felony disenfranchisement. And that report found that over 5 million individuals, close to 5.2 million residents around the United States, are disenfranchised from voting because of a felony conviction. People convicted in the criminal court systems with under a felony sentence at the state or federal level. that practice has a long history in the United States. English colonialists brought the practice over with them when they started occupying this land, and it was deepened after the Civil War during the post-Reconstruction period, where felony was used specifically as a proxy for Blackness in southern states that worked to reconstitute themselves and with the intent of disenfranchising the Black electorate. That history is clear when one looks at the constitutional history of states like Virginia, Alabama, and Mississippi. In Alabama and Mississippi specifically, those state constitutions enumerate a list of felony convictions that disqualify residents from voting. In Alabama, people are disqualified from voting. In the framers of that state's constitution, white male elite specifically, when thinking of how to include or exclude Black men from the franchise during the post-Reconstruction period, chose a list of felonies that they assumed that Black male residents would commit. So on that list of felonies, the crime of wife beating is included because of the assumption that Black men would be convicted at high rates of beating their wives. But the crime of homicide is not listed in that state's list of disqualifying felonies, which is called crimes of moral turpitude. So a Black man during the post-Reconstruction period in Alabama was disqualified from voting for beating his wife, but not for killing her, because of assumptions from the framers on who and how the proxy of felony would impact people in the franchise and exclude Black men from the franchise in particular. The number that we just found in that Locked Out 2020 report updates over 20 years of analysis that Chris Eugen and his original research partner, Jeff Manza, published in their 2004 book, Locked Out. And it is a decline, a modest decline since 2016, the last estimates that were generated by Eugen and his team, because there has been some major changes since that time, most notably Florida, which your students may already be familiar with, the fact that in 2018, Florida voters voted overwhelmingly to support felony disenfranchisement and end one of the most restrictive lifetime felony enfranchisement bans. And then we can get into the specifics, but the legislature has tried to work around that, further limiting the number of people impacted by it. But that change in Florida did reduce the number of people disenfranchised from over 6 million to just over 5 million this year. But it's still way too many people. It was only a 15% decline, way too modest, given the impact and given that the United States is really an outlier when it comes to other Western democracies and how racialized this practice is in the United States, and continues to be, not just because of the intent of state constitutional writers during the post-Reconstruction period and any other attempt to restrict the franchise for Black residents following that period, but given the era of mass incarceration. And since the 70s, we can chart the significant growth of people disenfranchised, disqualified from voting because of a felony conviction, which really mirrors the growth in incarceration. And so the fact that mass incarceration is a problem in the United States correlates to the significant impact for collateral consequences, including felony voting bans that can follow people for many years. And in states like Florida, has followed people for life. With the exception now that there's been some change to that.
Great, thanks. I want to dig into the to those changes, both what they have done and what they haven't done. But before that, I want to back up to what you were saying a moment ago of how distinctive this is. So are there other countries that have this kind of disenfranchisement, or is this really a U.S. If not a U.S. invention, at least a U.S. problem now in the 21st century?
It is the United States stands alone, certainly amongst Western democracies, in disqualifying people from voting with the felony, even people who happen to be in prison. Within the United States, there are 2 states, Maine and Vermont, that disqualify people where people never lose their voting rights, and they never did. So the writers of those states' constitutions never disenfranchised residents with felonies, and there's been no attempt to restrict voting rights for residents in those states. Recently, in the District of Columbia, the city council expanded voting rights to residents with felonies who happen to be in prison. So that's about 4,500 people who are currently in prison were allowed to vote this season today. It's new to the district, so in terms of impact, we don't know how many people actually voted, but certainly the intent of local officials was to ensure that all district residents, even those with felony who might be in prison, can vote. And also the territory of Puerto Rico expanded the franchise to people with felonies in the 80s. So there's a long history in Puerto Rico of people being able to vote from prison. And then the United States' practice, the fact that it's different from state to state, but the overwhelming practice here is that if you're in prison with the felony, you can't vote. That goes against international norms and is really, points to much of the current hypocrisy. I mean, the United States, there's always been a great deal of hypocrisy and a significant paradox, even with the founding of the United States, with the continued disenfranchisement of people who are in prison, particularly given that the international norms around this are very progressive when it comes to voting rights and allowing people who might be in prison the right to vote, really points to hypocrisy in the United States democracy because of this disqualification and other practices that I would say voting rights, regressive, well, they're not voting rights supporters, but, sort of regressive voting opponents employ with the goal of suppressing the vote rather than ensuring that every resident has a right to participate in who governs them. So the assumption that the United States is sort of this model of democracy really can be called into question when looking at practices of felony disenfranchisement, as well as other practices that contribute to voter oppression and voter suppression.
Can you say a little bit about just about the process of how people are disenfranchised? So you've mentioned a little bit that it varies from state to state, and so sort of, I guess, who makes those decisions, and can you give us some sense of the range, right? So some people are disenfranchised, as you said, some people are disenfranchised for life with a felony conviction. Some people are disenfranchised only when they're incarcerated. Some people can get it back on parole if they apply for it. Some people need to have it restored automatically. So can you just sort of say a little bit about the different kind of scenarios of what disenfranchisement looks like, and then who makes those decisions?
Yeah, well, when someone gets a felony conviction, and if there's a period of time that they're disqualified from voting, depending on the state that they reside in, the Secretary of State's office, which is responsible for maintaining voter eligibility lists, often matches current registered voters to list of newly convicted residents in the state, with felony convictions, which they receive from either a centralized state agency or from the Department of Corrections. And this infrastructure has developed in recent years with the goal of excluding from the franchise people with felony convictions in states where there's been a lot of motivation to limit voter participation. That era has really emerged following the 2000 election with Bush v. Gore, when during the 2000 election, a substantial number of people who were excluded from the Florida rolls were excluded because of a felony conviction. And since then, other practices with officials at the state and at the federal level with the intent to disqualify people from voting as opposed to, meet people where they are and try to support their participation in the franchise has really developed and emerged to help states limit list of eligible residents who can vote and move people off of voter eligibility, off of registered voter list, and putting the burden on the resident in terms of going through additional procedural hurdles to get back on these lists. So essentially, the process of voting in the United States, particularly if you're part of a marginalized group, if you have any sort of justice involvement, and if you have a felony conviction history, can be very onerous and, challenging to ensure that you are registered and perhaps going through additional registration processes if you have any sort of justice involvement. And then there have been high-profile prosecutions of justice-involved residents in a handful of states over the last couple of years, like Texas and North Carolina, and counties with very aggressive prosecutors that have gone after people, worked up cases, filed charges with the goal of disappearing people for voting voting illegally because they were on some form of criminal justice supervision. And that, I think, has the goal of leading to de facto disenfranchisement. So there's not a lot of people who sit in an office every day and match names to list. And there's not a lot of investigative resources to work at cases for everyone who's had a question, who might be on probation or parole, and then, register to vote or attempt to vote. But there have been high profile cases that have, made their way into the news with the goal of influencing the culture and influencing public sentiment or public awareness around, if you do vote incorrectly, then clearly you're at risk of prosecution and you're possibly at risk of imprisonment. So there's a high profile case in my home state of Texas following the 2016 election. This mother, Crystal Mason, she's a mother with teenage children, was on federal probation and thought she could vote, completed a provisional ballot at the guidance of the poll worker, the poll she went to vote at. And the Tarrant County prosecutor, which is a county right outside of Dallas, chose to file voting fraud charges on this woman, a felony charge. And she has been sentenced to 5 years in prison for this because she voted while on probation. And that sentence has been upheld by the state Supreme Court. So I don't think there's enough capacity to go after everyone who might vote like that, who has a felony conviction and may vote wrongly because they don't have the information or they get incorrect information from a poll worker. But I do think cases like hers, and there were similar cases in North Carolina, get reported on and help to reinforce this understanding that if you have a felony, you can't vote, or if you have a felony and you do vote, it's illegal, even though these laws are different from state to state. But the general narrative in this country is that if you have a felony conviction, you can't vote. So, there's not a lot of capacity to investigate everyone, but I think that there's enough interest and there's enough sort of anti-voting activists in this country, for lack of a better way to say it, who are hell-bent on proving that voting fraud is a thing and don't mind disappearing people, for years for voting incorrectly. And this woman voted, she did a provisional ballot. So the theory is you're supposed to be able to go to the polls if you think you can vote and submit a provisional ballot, and you shouldn't be at risk of prosecution in prison if you complete a provisional ballot. So the idea that she was actually prosecuted and convicted and sentenced for this is just it's just outrageous.
And there's just a question in the chat about the sort of legal justification here. I know there are other questions, I'm going to get to them, but since this was a question directly in response to this point, Crystal Mason, I posted an article about that case. Like, she was charged with voter fraud. Like that is the kind of legal issue that people are being prosecuted for in these kinds of cases, right? Is that it's sort of violating the integrity of the election, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah.
You mentioned that these policies sort of change from state to state. So what are some of the ways that they change?
So there has been significant changes since the 2000 election. I think that election in particular animated a great deal of activism in the early 2000s. So since 1997, 25 states have expanded the franchise to people with felony conviction histories. That ranges from Rhode Island passing a ballot measure in 2006 that ended lifetime disenfranchisement in that state, to 2018's Amendment 4 in Florida, where over 60% of voters supported ending lifetime disenfranchisement there for most people with felony convictions in the state, and expanding voting rights to up to 1.5 million residents in the state. On the ballot this year in California is Proposition 17, which would expand voting rights to people living in the community on parole in the state of California. And there's been a host of other changes as well over the last couple of years. In my home state of Texas, lifetime disenfranchisement was ended, but now people that we call on paper, so those are people who live in the community on felony probation or parole, are disqualified from voting. And that's tens of thousands of residents in that state who have to pay taxes and are expected to be good neighbors but can't vote. Georgia is also a state with a very high number of people on probation that live in the community. In fact, some people are disqualified from voting and they may never spend time in prison. They may spend time pre-trial in a jail cell and then agree to a probation sentence where they're sentenced to a term of supervision in the community for 3 years, 5 years. It's a trap where people might cycle in and out, and we can get into the specifics of that. But the main thing is that while in the community, people's constitutional rights are weakened, including voting rights. And so in Georgia, if you're on probation, you can't vote in that state. Other reforms, last year, Nevada, Colorado, and New Jersey all expanded voting rights to people who live in the community on supervision. And that was tens of thousands of individuals in those states. So New Jersey, I think 73,000 people got their voting rights back when the legislature passed that reform. And similarly in Colorado and Nevada, tens of thousands of people in those states got their changes back. Because of that modest decline that I mentioned earlier between 2016 and 2020, we're pushing for universal suffrage for everyone. We don't think that the criminal legal system should be in a position to limit people's constitutional rights or limit people's voting rights, period. And so we're really motivated by the reform in DC, where the city council expanded voting rights to people in prison, and are hopeful that that'll lead to a new trend that other states will expand voting rights to people in prison as well. And in 2018, there were credible legislative reforms that made their way through state legislative processes, although they didn't become law in New Mexico and Connecticut and Hawaii. So I'm hopeful that going into 2021, depending on how things play out this year, that there will be real opportunity to expand voting rights to people in prison.
Yeah, you mentioned a few minutes ago that half of the states have expanded the franchise since 1997, and yet only 2 states have no restrictions, right? And so the Sentencing Project is launching this campaign for universal suffrage. So even in the context of reform, right, of expanding the franchise, there seem to be a lot of limits that states have put in place. So can you say what some of those limits are, and how people how states have expanded the franchise for some but not others, and what that process has looked like?
Yeah, I mean, it's really messy too, in how these enfranchisement policies play out, particularly in states where some felonies result in disqualification, voting disqualification, but others don't, which leads to confusion for residents who wanna vote and have questions about whether or not they can, but also leads to confusion with electors and people whose job it is, or even those who work in a volunteer capacity, to educate and to share correct information with residents, like the person in Texas that provided the provisional ballot to Crystal Mason, that contributed to the circumstances of her case. I won't say that person is at fault, but these policies are confusing because they vary from state to state, and there's no central agency that is responsible for maintaining the information and sharing it with those who need it, including residents, to ensure access to the franchise. So Tennessee is one state that I'm looking at, and they're wanting to work with residents there who want to develop a credible effort to try to expand voting rights in that state. The issue is complicated because there was a period of time in the late 70s to early 80s where people convicted in that time period can vote, because there was no voting disenfranchisement in Tennessee at that time. So if somebody's felony record is limited to the late 70s to 1981, then they can actually vote. But clarifying that for them is something requires a lot of work. And then also there were certain felony convictions that don't disqualify people from voting in that state. And that's also similar in Florida and Delaware as well. And as I sort of mentioned earlier, in Mississippi and Alabama, where the disqualifying felonies are listed out in the state constitution. But given how complicated state criminal codes are, that there is criminalized behavior, there's criminalized offenses for a range of activity, not just the specified ones. Clarifying that for residents is important, and also contributes to this need to have accurate information available. I'll also say, since we are in this era where sort of tough on crime local prosecutors who are interested in making a name for themselves and want to pursue voting fraud cases like Crystal Mason, and presumably potentially that could be other cases as well, given whatever period we're about to enter into, depending on what happens today and going into the future, that the movement has to be concerned around and has to work to not put people at risk around voting. And then if people are prosecuted, outrageously prosecuted for voting fraud cases, to be made an example of, that there has to be support for people with great defense and, to help them avoid a prison sentence and a court disposition, if not help to mitigate against any circumstances around that. And then just to counter this trend we're in, or this era that we might be going through, where local prosecutors want to prove without care that they're literally disappearing people, and that their prosecutions have consequences for the residents that they want to make an example of. So these differences, the policies vary from state to state, and it's important to look specifically at the state practice that you're curious about looking at. I know in Washington state, people who have fines and fees obligation, there was a period of time where fines and fees obligation could limit voting rights. So you had to pay off all of your court mandated fines and fees before you could register to vote. I think there's been some work around that, but that's the current policy in Florida that was upheld by a court ruling a few weeks ago, and led to substantial need for fundraising, millions of dollars by Bloomberg and other celebrities to help the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition pay off the fines and fees of justice-involved residents in that state. And they've done that. They've paid millions of dollars towards fines and fees of felony of directly impacted voters in that state.
Yeah, I want to kind of build on that and merge a question in the chat with a question that I had. So do you see kind of legal challenges being the sort of most being effective versus, like in Florida, it was done at the ballot box. In Kentucky, it was a sort of governor's, just a new governor who sort of made a kind of executive decision, right? So do you see, are there kind of legal challenges where to disenfranchisement, or to overturn disenfranchisement? Was a question that came up in the chat. But then my question, you're speaking mostly to a group of students who, as far as I know, are not millionaires. And so what are ways, other than like being able to like fund some of those defense campaigns and so on, for people who are concerned about disenfranchisement and concerned about voting rights to sort of have their say, right, or be involved on this issue?
Yeah. I think there's going to be a mix of strategies to expand the franchise going forward, particularly if we organize, credible capacity to expand voting rights to people who are in prison. Maybe in some districts around the country, litigation is a strategy. I certainly to protect people against what I say, unconscionable prosecutions. If there's some desire to, try to criminalize voting, that'll be critical. I think most of this will happen with organizing and then legislative reform. That organizing might be in states where a ballot measure is possible, but ballot measures aren't possible in all states. So really the legal remedy or the reform remedy is going to be through the state legislature. So efforts to change the law in whatever way that's practical and credible, but supported by popular will around that, and to demonstrate that there will need to be organized community discussions, popular support for that, in ways that demonstrate that expanding the franchise is welcomed by the general public within any state or any jurisdiction. And there's so much work to be done around that, within the movement. I think the general sort of support for it at this point is for people post-sentence. That means people who've completed probation or parole. This is even for progressive activists, for people who have completed probation or parole. And when people say post-sentence, that may mean in a state like Florida, you have to pay off your fines and fees, which part of the problem is that people don't even understand or know exactly what they owe. There are all these anecdotal reports that people thought they had satisfied their fines and fees obligation when they were released from their probation sentence like 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Then when they went to register to vote, when Amendment 4 passed, all of a sudden they were told by the court that they owed X number of dollars. And if people didn't have an extra $1,000 in the middle of a pandemic, when a lot of people have lost jobs or are trying to stretch their savings, then, without this fundraising campaign, maybe those people still wouldn't be able to vote if, and hopefully they were able to satisfy those obligations and get registered and vote this season. So what can people do who don't have money is they can help with the community support and community will. Organize discussions, conversations in your community, at your university campus. Formalize that in some way by documenting it and sharing it out, so that when there are credible discussions around expanding the franchise, including what I hope you all are is to people in prison, but in any way that's useful, so that people can point to that and emphasize and help to sort, and that can contribute to an organizing narrative that there is general support, that there is popular support for expanding voting rights to people with felony conviction histories in the United States.
So, and you said there has been sort of polling support, or this was a question that came up earlier about sort of public opinion data on reenfranchisement that supports it post sentence. Is that what you said?
Yeah, there's overwhelming support for post sentence disenfranchisement. The question of voting for people in prison is new, and so that's not something we've done a lot of testing on, but hopefully there will, public opinion, public sentiment around that will continue to grow as we work to have that conversation and get states to expand the franchise to people who are in prison.
I want to ask how it works in jail, because obviously the majority of people in jail are awaiting trial, and how does that fit?
That is certainly something that people could do right now, is engage with jail voting campaigns and jail voting registration efforts. So that looked a lot different this year, but in previous years when there wasn't a public health crisis that we were trying to keep people safe from, not just people in the community, but also people in jail who are at risk significantly of COVID. Civic groups were invited in at the discretion of sheriffs and jail administrators to do voter registration efforts and support absentee voting efforts. There's a long history around that. A lot of that is hyper-local activity. My experience is that this year, I have never seen so much attention to jail-based voting. It's very encouraging, very exciting. There's been campaigns in California, Washington State and Seattle, in Philadelphia, and DC, where I am. A trend around jail-based voting is to allow actual polling sites to be at the jail so that it doesn't have to be through absentee voting, but people can actually complete their ballots, on site in the jail. So in Illinois, the state legislature mandated that counties with certain population levels, including they were specifically looking at Cook County, where Chicago is, to establish a polling location in the Cook County Jail, which is one of the largest jail sites in the country. In California and Los Angeles, one of the jails that make up the Los Angeles County Jail was a polling site earlier this year. So there's a lot of work to be done. And for people who are interested in guaranteeing access to voting rights for justice-involved residents, starting with the jail is a great site. There's a lot of work to be done to go in and register people to vote, to support absentee voting, or to get a polling location at the jail. I mentioned Illinois, that focus on a state strategy, but you could attempt to get it done through the county leadership, either getting the commissioner's court or whatever it's called in your local county to establish a polling site at the jail and figure out if, how that might get implemented and get done in your local area. So there's a great deal of work. I see that you're posting research about that in Washington. So that is something that students can definitely be doing now, or which over the next 2 years, to start to politicize themselves around voting for justice-involved residents, and starting with the jail and organizing around the jail to go in and do those voter registration efforts there. And there's so many resources on that. I'm sure there's a great deal of resources in Washington State, but if people are interested in other resources, and with just basic how-tos, how to get started on a jail-based voter registration effort and what that might look like, there are many resources like that available that I can connect folks to or share out.
Thank you. Yeah, that'd be great. I put the Sentencing Project website early in the chat, but I'll post it again. So just want to remind everyone to post your questions in the chat as we go. There are two questions have come up going in different directions. I'll ask them both, and you can. No, I won't. I'll ask one and then the other. Okay, so the first is what kind of arguments do what you sort of so delightfully called the anti-voting activists give for denying people the right to vote? Like what is the argument here that that sort of disenfranchisement holds?
There's a couple of national sort of opponents to voting rights. And they sort of, well, they have interesting names. So one guy is Han von Spakovsky. I believe he works for the Heritage Foundation. Another guy is named Roger Clegg. He might also be associated with the Heritage Foundation. If not, it's with a right-wing group. I mean, basically, they think that voting rights should not be as broad as possible for all residents in the United States. And it's very easy for voting rights opponents to lift up this image of a criminal and as a poster person to restrict voting rights and to reinforce any voting limitations that the country has and maintains. Their arguments are that, these are people who've committed crimes. So as people who've committed crimes, they should not have a role in electing people who, in electing people who will have decisions on what crimes are or reforming crimes. So basically, because they, have been convicted of a crime and are under some form of criminal justice supervision, that they should not have a role in who governs them, that they lost that right. And, the history around this, it is about this social contract. So people were disqualified from voting. They had a civil death because they broke the social contract and they committed that crime. So now, even in 2020, those sort of same broad themes are present in voting rights opponents' arguments. I'll say that the sentence in and of itself is the punishment. People are punished very excessively in the United States. Our criminal justice system is very punitive compared to other Western democracies. We can get into that at another time. I know you all are probably getting into that in this class. And in the United States, because people can literally be under criminal justice supervision for life, even if somebody is in the community after they spent time in prison, they can be on some form of supervision for life. There are people who are on parole for the rest of their lives in states like New Hampshire. They're on probation for 10, 20 years in states like my home state of Texas or Minnesota. So while they're in the community, and even while they're in prison, they're expected to pay taxes. People in prison pay taxes. They pay extremely high telephone bills. So not only are they carrying that water in terms of paying these really high fees, but so is their family members who bear that burden. They pay really high fees when they buy any products in prison at the commissary or the local store where they can get extra food and extra supplies. Extremely high fees. I mean, almost like, I don't know if you've been to an island, part of like an island economy, but the fees are so marked up inside of prison commissaries that the burden of, buying extra snacks or a razor or hygiene products is extremely expensive inside of prisons. So those arguments are that losing voting rights is that people should lose the privilege because they broke the social contract and they committed a crime. But again, I'll say, people are still expected to participate in the social contract by paying taxes, by rehabilitating themselves. And so they don't lose their humanity just because they're in prison. And they're still there. They're still citizens. They're still residents of the country. So we do not think that they should lose their voting rights, period.
And for those of you in my class, I mean, this is the warehouse model of incarceration, right? Where the punishment is the point. And I think the what you're talking about, Nicole, I think we see the ways that states offer some states have offered some expansion to the franchise, but still have excluded people convicted of certain offenses or have sort of maintained disenfranchisement is exactly what you're saying, right? Is that continuation of punishment for its own sense, right? There's no. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, and then prison gerrymandering is also an example of this hypocrisy. So under prison gerrymandering, people are counted where they are, not where they're from. So the criminal justice system, criminal legal system has this function of extracting people from their home communities and placing them more often than not in communities, in prison warehouses, outside of their home communities, and they're counted. We're in a census year. In most states, although there has been some reform around this, people are counted where they're imprisoned at, which has the function of inflating that local district's population, which then benefits that local district with additional tax dollars and public resources. And then the extraction of those 1.4 million people from their home communities has serves the function of diluting the tax base and the worker base and the population base of those home communities, so that those communities cannot count their home residents from where they are and benefit from any public dollars or any other factors that are achieved through the census taking.
Yeah, and there's a question in the chat about the impact on elections that disenfranchisement has had or that reenfranchisement would have. And you talked earlier about Florida in 2000, but
we
I
know
guess
in Florida that Bush v. Gore was determined on 537 votes in Florida in 2000. And we'll see how close some of these election contests are this year, but they're pretty close. There's a potentiality. They have a potential for being very close in states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. And Wisconsin is a state that in 2016, I think the current president won that state by 20,000 votes, if I'm remembering correctly. I may have that off, but there is a high rate of incarceration in Milwaukee, and one zip code in Milwaukee, in particular 5207 or 5206 zip code. It's got the highest rate of incarceration amongst Black men by zip code in the country. And in Wisconsin, people are disqualified from voting while on supervision, while on felony probation or parole, and of course for people in prison. So the criminal legal system has this function of, at this point, of mediating between the resident, the citizen, and the state, and controlling, whether or not citizens have a role in the franchise, and which is all the more reason why the criminal legal system should be taken completely out of the voting process and voting rights altogether.
Sorry, I was trying to follow up in the chat by posting how many people are disenfranchised in Wisconsin, but I couldn't find it fast enough. But it looks like, sorry.
But did I see it right?
Yeah, you were right on the number.
Okay.
And then it looks like 65,000 people disenfranchised in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
So obviously, it's by no means a guarantee that all of those people would vote for the same person, but a significant percentage, right? That far more people are disenfranchised than these sort of razor thin margins are, right? And so when I talked to people about disenfranchisement, this is like the main thing that I want to stress, right, is how artificial the whole narrative about U.S. politics is, about how close these races are, about the sort of allocation of power and resources, when so many people are either legally prohibited from voting or otherwise sort of lack access to voting. And we can see, yeah, someone wins by 20,000 votes, but there were 65,000 people who couldn't vote. It's a really big difference. Sorry, and you're the speaker, not me. But
no, it's important. Yeah, it's a really good way to think about it.
There were a couple of questions. Obviously, there's a lot that could happen today and in the days to come, and there's a few decades between now and January of 2021. But assuming that if Biden and Harris win, there were a couple of questions about what do you think their response would be, not necessarily on disenfranchisement, but on things like the federal death penalty, or on other kind of criminal justice issues.
Well, I think that they're going to have a lot to. I think there's going to be a strong possibility to hold them accountable for their previous records, right? And I think, I have a lot to say about this that we don't have time for today, but what often gets pointed to around Biden's record is his role in the 94 crime bill. And there, I think, is a misunderstanding of history and wanting to blame the 94 crime bill for the rise in incarceration. Actually, the number of people in prison started going up way before 1994, and it started in the 70s. And actually, the growth of incarceration so substantial it can be dated back to the early 80s, when the federal and state systems had grown very substantially in about a 10-year time period. And we can, I'm happy to come back, or happy to have like a longer discussion where we can like get into all of that. But I think because there's this organizing narrative right now that points to the 94 crime bill, that it will have a function of moving Biden and Harris potentially to the left around responding to that and working to repair that. I know that the Movement for Black Lives, their policy piece is the Breathe Act that has been sponsored by Presley and Tlaib. And depending on how today goes, if more members get added to the Progressive Squad or the Progressive Caucus, and there's going to be a stronger coalition to have a very progressive agenda for the next Congress and try to set progressive norms that hopefully start with repairing the harm done of the policies that got adopted in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that contributed to mass incarceration. And because of Biden's role in the 94 crime bill, that can be something that advocates point intentionally to, with the goal of working to challenge him and his administration to repair the harm done for that, in addition to engaging with some perspective changes as well. So I think that that's what's possible if they get elected, is working from their left, pushing them. I think that there is already a base of opinion for that. And then I think it'll be on the activist community to have that conversation and push it and figure out ways to do it that will hopefully lead to some real legal change and some remedies that get adopted and implemented.
And are there things that, as the Sentencing Project sort of unfolds this universal suffrage campaign, that people, I've been posting the website, but are there things that people should know about or do, or ways to sort of be involved in that?
And the universal suffrage, we have a petition on our website, so everyone can sign the petition. And then if there's interest to mount a universal suffrage campaign in Washington State, let's talk about that and strategize around that. Would love to continue to engage with people around that who want to try to get a bill introduced or figure out what the practical strategy is around that. I mean, I think a short-term strategy, are there progressive cities in Washington State? Would Seattle be a place to try? I don't know if it's like legally possible there, but to see if everyone can vote in local elections in Seattle, even people with felonies in the Seattle jail, or people who might be in state prison in Washington State, but could vote absentee in local elections in Seattle, or in King County. Seattle's in King County. Yeah, in King County. So yeah, so if people are interested in trying a strategy like that, I'd be open to talking about it. And then, you know, we have to repair these horrible laws that are on the books, and then actually get people relief that have been put in prison. So Washington State has a substantial number of people who are sentenced to life in prison there. There have been reforms over the last couple of years to try to repeal life without parole sentences and the habitual statutes, or the 3 strikes laws in Washington State. All of that needs to happen. Hopefully there's going to be more support to do those legislative changes. And in the meantime, again, if there are local strategies to help repair the harm, there's a trend where these progressive prosecutors who claim to be against mass incarceration prosecutors, they're very focused on not charging people with marijuana offenses. Those are good steps, but not near enough to help repair the harm around mass incarceration. Many prosecutors have the authority, if not all prosecutors have the authority, to reopen cases and actually re-sentence people who might have been sentenced 20, 30 years ago and have been in prison all this time because of an excessive prosecution, or an extreme or over sentencing prosecution. So there could be local pressure to focus attention on prosecutors in King County and other counties around Washington State to reopen cases and re-sentence people.
That's wonderful, and really delightful roadmap of things to do. And on the point about 3 strikes, another thing I always like to remind people is that Washington was actually the first state to pass a 3 strikes law. Right? So California gets the lion's share of the attention because it's a bigger state and prison population is so big, but Washington was first in that sort of ignoble policy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm such a joy at parties. Okay, well, thank you, Nicole, so much for being here. I still haven't figured out a great way for everyone to sort of thank our guest speaker. It seems like you could put something in the chat, or a little emoji in your box is great. And just remind people that our next guest speaker as part of this series will be November 24th. We'll be talking about correctional industries and labor and punishment inside of Washington prisons. If you're in my class, we'll take a break and we'll come back at 12:10. If you're not in my class, see you another time. And I hope all of us can have some joy and tranquility today and in the days ahead. And again, thank you so much, Nicole.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks everybody. Appreciate it.